Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So, Paulo, first things first, to peel back the curtain, happy birthday, and surely the Rockets won't lose to Wemby and the Spurs on your birthday on this Tuesday, March 5th, right?
Dude. No promises here. We typically do play on my birthday, but I cannot keep memory of how well or poorly it usually goes. But Wemby's, he's on a streak right now. He's, finally, and he could probably be, if he played this level throughout the entire season, he'd probably be all NBA. So it's going to be tough, although the rest of the Spurs are in pretty dire condition. But then again, it's the Rockets. We can lose to anyone, and we can win against most teams. I'm not going to say anyone, because beating the Pelicans, although we did it once, is really hard.
Well, I will say, and perhaps this ages poorly, because I know Tuesday's game will tip off a few hours after we get this uploaded, but I sort of feel good about it just from the standpoint of, we know how good the Rockets consistently are at home. They're 20-10 at Toyota Center this season. And the Spurs, their last two games, extremely encouraging, double-digit wins against the Thunder and the Pacers, both in San Antonio. It just seems like a classic spot where a very young team is due for a regression. They're flying high, and now they're going into an environment in Houston where the Rockets play very well. To me, this is a classic spot for a letdown in a Spurs team that, I know the Rockets are young, but the Spurs are a lot younger, and they're on the road. So not going to be easy. The length of Wemby is just an insane deterrent on the drives, but I think the Rockets will be favored for good reason. And we'll start there. Let's talk about the recent on-court products, because our last episode was on the Thursday coming out of the All-Star break, and we discussed the very difficult 6-game stretch coming up. You had the Suns 3 times, the Thunder twice, and then that game in New Orleans that first Thursday out of the break. And the Rockets went 2-4, and they're now 26-34 on the season. And that's not normally something to celebrate. However, when you adjust it to the schedule, it's honestly a pretty good showing, especially when you consider that they went 2-1 against a Phoenix team that had Devin Booker and Kevin Durant for all 3 of those games. So it could have been a lot worse for a team that limped into the All-Star break, losing 6 of their last 7 games. Ime Udoka opted not to change the starting lineup, and at least the last couple of games have rewarded him with Jalen Green going off for 34 apiece in each of them. His defense has been much improved as well. Really, the entire team collectively has been much better on the defensive end since the All-Star break, and I think that's something that we assumed would happen, but it's good to see it actually play out that way. I think a lot of the slippage on defense in January and early February was due to the injuries, a lot of games, and a tight time frame. And with a chance to heal up over the All-Star break and get some of your guys back and your veterans like Fred and Dylan that had been perhaps a little worn down by injuries and usage leading into the All-Star break, you would hope to see them a bit more active on the other side. I think by and large, that's what's happened. For most of this season, the Rockets have been an above average defensive team, and now they're back to being that. Even if it's not the elite levels that they were at when they were good early this season, the defense has bounced back, and that also speaks well to Ime Udoka. He still has these guys bought in. But what's really interesting is the transformation on the offensive end of the court. We heard right after the Rockets got out of the All-Star break, this declaration from Ime Udoka that they were going to try and shoot 40-plus threes per game as a team. And more often than not, they've done it. That Saturday win in Phoenix, they were 16 of 42 from 3. The Suns were 9 of 29, and that math advantage took the Rockets to the finish line. And I think it's really interesting in that it coincides with a new version of Jalen Green. You look at his stats since the break, he's actually shooting below 3 free throw attempts per game. We've talked throughout the season about going from 6.1 last season, which was a step forward in free throws per game, to just a little over 4, one of many discouraging things about Jalen's third year to date. And now it's gone down even more, yet the efficiency has actually ticked up a little bit because he's shooting, of his 18 shots per game, 9 are from three-point range, and he's shooting basically 39% on those. So if you're a volume three-point shooter and you're making 39% of them, you're going to look pretty efficient, even if you aren't getting to the free throw line. And that's what's happened to Jalen over this recent stretch. And to some extent, the same as held true with Jabari Smith Jr., although he's not making threes to nearly the extent that Jalen has in this recent 6-game stretch. But those are the two guys in particular that seem to have much more of a green light from behind the arc. And I think, especially against the Suns, who are a team that's, I think, bottom 5 in the league in three-point volume, which makes sense because over the years, they've had so many mid-range assassins. Obviously, they have KD and Booker now. They did have Chris Paul the last few years. And so for the Rockets going up against a good team like that, there's conceivably a math advantage. If you go out and shoot at high volume, that's what they did, and it got them 2 wins in 3 games against a Suns team that at a bare minimum should make the playoffs. But beyond just that individual matchup, my suspicion as to the thought process over the All-Star break, I just think that, especially against good teams, but even I would go as far to say most teams, average or better teams, I think on some level there was a realization that the Rockets simply don't have the talent or depth, especially without Tari Eason, who's now ruled out for the season, to win the conventional way. So if you're down from a talent perspective, or I guess you can call it maturity, because some of these guys are young, but the point is, if you're not going to win games just based on execution and talent, then you need to find an advantage at the margins. And for the Rockets, three-point volume is one of those areas that they can control. And so I think what you've seen Ime Udoka and his staff do is encourage these guys to go out and take a bombs away approach. And it's not that they're going to go in every single night, but it should, in theory, prevent you from going into any super long dry spells in terms of wins and losses, because you are going to have some nights like Saturday in Phoenix where it's going your way. And I just think that it's interesting from a team perspective. You know, we talked a couple of months ago about, well, should Jalen take more of a mid-range approach because that's where he's had more success this season. The three-point shot hasn't been there. And individually, that might be the case. But from a team perspective, what you really want to avoid, and what we were afraid of potentially happening going into the All-Star break, was this rot of losing, to where with the play-in tournament becoming less and less possible for this team, do they eventually succumb to what we saw the last 2 or 3 years, in which there's a lot of games where they just aren't trying? And I think with this approach, you sort of guarantee yourself some wins, because if you shoot at volume and then you make a healthy amount at volume, you're going to be tough to beat. Then at a bare minimum, it's going to keep you afloat. It's going to keep you competitive. And that's the sort of thing that, can it get the Rockets back in the play-in picture? I don't know. But I do think it can keep them potentially competitive for the remainder of the season and avoid any just super prolonged losing streaks. And I don't know what that means individually, because I think for some of these guys, I don't know that that's the long-term formula that you want to use when they're at their best. But let's just be honest. We can look at Jabari, and we've drawn comparisons to guys like Rasheed Wallace, LaMarcus Aldridge at times this year, but he just doesn't have the strength to regularly be that guy now. With Jalen Green, we know the upside, and I don't really want to focus too much on Jalen specifically, because in this discourse of, has Jalen figured it out? Has he turned a corner? We've had that same discussion a million times. It's pointless to really speculate on that until he does it for a sustained period. Hopefully those games in Phoenix are the start of that, but time will tell. At this point, I'm just going to assume that it's one of those random hot streaks that we hope it continues. But until it does, I'm going to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism. So for me, this new approach offensively, and that's what's changed. Defensively, I think it's just getting healthier. The energy's back, and so that's picked up. But offensively, I think this three-point volume approach, looking at the math margins, I just think it's a way that, unless your shooting is just comically bad, and I don't think the Rockets ever viewed themselves as in that tier, then you should be able to win at least some games through this approach, and that potentially gets you through this season at a fairly respectable level, which is what I think they've been trying to do in this sort of transition back to relevancy. I don't know that it's the formula long term. It doesn't have to be. I want to stress that it's not as if you have to shoot threes at a high volume. I just pulled up in terms of the 30 NBA teams, when you look at 3-point attempts per game, Phoenix is 26, the Nuggets are 28, the Lakers are 30. Phoenix obviously has KD and Devin Booker. They're a contender. The Nuggets won the championship last year. The Lakers won the championship a couple of years before that on the back of LeBron James and Anthony Davis, who they still have. So it's one of those things, if you have different ways to play, the Suns have their mid-range guys and they can get to the rim as well. The Nuggets and Lakers obviously have a ton of size and can dominate games near the rim. The Rockets don't have any of those things. So that's why I think for a team like the Rockets in particular, it's especially important to try and find that margin advantage, because I just think at this point, when you take a step back, and that's what the All-Star break is for, think big picture, they just don't yet have those advantages that you can trust on a game in, game out basis. So it seems like they're sort of turning to math to try to get them through the rest of this season, hopefully scrape out, 35-ish wins and have a respectable record. Or as individual development, hoping for guys to take a further leap, that's something that you look at over the offseason and into training camp. That's sort of my 30,000 foot view thoughts on what we've seen since the All-Star break. Paolo, where are you at as far as the newfound math advantage and what Ime's trying to do?
Yeah, I think it isn't really. I mean, you could say it's a math advantage, but I'd actually call it's just strategically a better option as we get more and more data points that prove to us that this team right now, from a talent perspective, while the upside is really high, we aren't going to consistently out-talent other teams on our way to victories. And so it's worth taking the approach of, well, if you shoot more threes, you're a higher variance team. And so you take the chance that brings you more wins via hot shooting nights than it would the other way around, where you're trying to brute force offense down the other team's throats, and you're kind of dependent on a lot of factors. How you're finishing at the rim, how you're hitting mid-range shots, how many fouls are the refs calling on your drives, how much physicality is being allowed, all of those things. And so it really just makes sense. And when you look back at the games that we've played lately since the quote unquote change, you can see, the Suns game, the first time around when we won, we were losing up until halftime, and then we took over at halftime and we held the lead for a long period of time, and then it was close down the stretch again. Against the Thunder the first time around, we were up big for a large stretch of the game, and then the shooting ran out, and we basically got blown out in the last quarter and a half. The second time around against the Thunder, we kept the game close while we were hot from three, and then we got completely blown out when the shooting fell off. The game against the Suns, we were just completely blown out the entire way through, and you go and you check, and we shot 24% from three. That's basically been the story of the games with this new formula. And then obviously the last game we were just hot basically throughout. The Suns got closer, but they were never really able to crack the Rockets' lead. We've tried the other approach, so it makes sense to, at the All-Star break, make a little bit of a change and see if you can scrape out a few more wins than you would with the other approach that you're taking. The other thing that makes this make sense or makes this a little bit more feasible is the personnel changes, right? If you're playing Jason Tate and if you're starting Amen Thompson, obviously you're not going to be as good of a shooting team as you would while starting Fred VanVleet and playing other guys instead, playing basically Aaron Holiday. So I think those were the two ways that they kind of tried to go about making that change. And honestly, I'm for it, because you made a really good point about the rot of losing, and you really, who knows how big of, from a mood of the team standpoint, how big a win like the Suns one was, or in this case, both of the Suns wins were. And then you've also got to realize that sometimes we're just going to get out-talented. Like, we don't have a KD, we don't have a Devin Booker, we don't have a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander like the teams that we've been facing do. And listen, there were points in that Thunder game where the Rockets were within striking distance, and then Shai Gilgeous-Alexander just happened. And no matter how good of a defense you put against him, he's going to score anyways. He's one of the best scorers in the NBA, man, and just do it consistently. You can hope that he misses his threes, but in the games that he played against us, even that wasn't working. So it is what it is. as far as those games go. But yeah, I think especially with the rise of Cam Whitmore, it just makes more sense to try and play this way. And surprisingly, I would have expected that with more threes, the offensive possessions would last shorter, which would put more strain on the defense from an energy perspective. But they've been able to keep up, decently well on defense, and I think in no small part because, and this at least has been happening as time as it's not just a post All-Star break thing, but Amen Thompson has absolutely broken out as a defensive player, and I think he is not eventually, he is right now, even though Udoka hasn't recognized this yet, and he still puts Dylan Brooks on the best defensive assignments, but he is the best on-ball defender on the team, and he might have an argument for being the best off-ball defender on the team as well, just because of his athleticism and how poor we are in general at off-ball defense, at least from a help defense and rim protection standpoint. And so when you combine the newfound 3-point volume with the improvements on defense that, in my opinion, are in no small part because how well Amen Thompson is playing, and how if you have Dylan Brooks on you and you call for a screen and the guy you're getting afterwards is Amen Thompson, your life gets that much tougher. And we aren't seeing, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is going to drop 30 to 35 on any given team. So that's not a star player going off on you. That's just normal for him. In other stretches of the season, we'd be giving up 50 to a guy like this. Devin Booker, in the first game we played against him, he did have, I think, 24 points. I can double check really quick. He had 25 points, but he was 7 for 24 from the field. Right. So there's definitely things to just translating, going from the day-to-day things to the macro analysis. I think there's definitely things that you can take from the last few games that you can scale up and make you optimistic about the future, because no matter how, and it's a point that I wanted to make that I've been battling with throughout the last couple of weeks, no matter how much we get stuck in what the day-to-day looks like, and sometimes it gets really ugly, we need to really strive to not make definitive judgment on anybody based on any given game, because I promise you, any given game is going to look like much bigger of a deal at the moment than it will be at the end of the season. People keep saying we're hitting lower rock bottoms at multiple points in the season, but when you look back at the end of the season, or even right now, to rock bottom points throughout the season, you probably won't even remember them. And when you take a step back, and even if you don't believe in Jalen Green anymore, which I think is tough it's tough to believe in him right now, this team still has Ime Udoka, still has a favorable cap position, especially with the optionality on Jeff Green, Fred VanVleet, Jock Landale, etc. When you combine that with how promising Cam Whitmore has looked, even though he struggled the past few games, with how promising Amen Thompson has looked with all his faults, there's things there that have already translated at an elite level that are going to continue to do so. Combine that with Şengün, with Jabari Smith, and Tari Eason, who I know we'll have a little bit of a segment on, because how could you not? I think even if you don't make the play in this season, which will be a disappointment considering the start of the season, no denying that, I don't think you can make the argument that this team doesn't have a bright outlook unless, and this is something that really triggers me, you can't both have this team is like failing or in the gutter or has a bleak future. You can say that and at the same time say, oh, I really like Amen and Cam and Şengün and Tari Eason and Jabari Smith Jr. You can't have both. If you're high on 5 prospects, all under 22 years old, you can't at the same time say the team has a bleak future. You gotta pick one. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't wanna. I think a lot of people wanna be doom and gloom because of the day-to-day stuff that happens prompts that. But at the same time, don't wanna put out there that maybe they're not as high on some of these young guys as they say they are.
And looking at the next 3 weeks, there's a lot of winnable games in there. And I think if the Rockets, we've talked about getting to the mid to upper 30s being potentially important psychologically to viewing this season still in a positive light, that even though things got away from them a bit in the middle of the year, especially with the injuries and tougher schedule in there as well, that if you can finished the last third of the season somewhat comparable to that first third when you went 15-12 and were right in the mix, then it's easier to sort of look at that middle third as a bit of an aberration and have more excitement just based on the way the team is now and what you hope is further internal development from a lot of these young guys that you've been talking about. And you look at the next 3 weeks, home against the Spurs, home against the Clippers, that one's tough. At Portland, at San Antonio, home versus the Wizards, home versus the Cavaliers. There is a game at Sacramento in there that I skipped. Then, let's see, after the Cleveland game, at Washington, home versus the Bulls, home versus the Jazz, home versus the Trailblazers. There's a lot of potential wins in there. I'm not going to go as far as to say that the Rockets can really threaten the Lakers or the Warriors for a play-in tournament spot. I'll believe it when I see it. The Rockets would really need to reel off a winning streak of probably 7-8 in a row. When you're back 5 games the way they are at 26-34, you really need to reel off an extended winning streak. And, the downside to this high 3-point volume strategy, it may prevent you from having a long drought, but at the same time, it might prevent you from having a super long win streak as well, because you're prone to have at least a couple of clunkers in there as well, to where the shot luck just isn't going your way on a given night. But generally speaking, it's a manageable schedule. The Rockets got through this difficult 6-game stretch, and that's why we said coming out of the All-Star break, it was so important. And 2-4 is so much better than 1-5 or 0-6, because if you're looking at, 12 losses in 13 games, including, 7 or 8 in a row, that's where some of the rot of losing stuff can come into play. As it is, they won a couple of games. They're 2-2 in their last. No, it's 2-3 in their last 5, but they're 2-1 in the 3 against Phoenix, which is a good team. So yeah, there's things that they can build on, and it sounds like we're largely in agreement on the reasons that Ime is doing this. And I do think it speaks well to the coaching staff, their willingness to adapt. I think in the modern NBA, the most important characteristic a coach can have is be willing to shape his system to the personnel. And with this particular team, we talked about the inconsistencies with Jalen and Jabari, especially in the offensive end. Şengün, since about mid-January, has not been as consistent, although while he's not as dominant as a scorer on an every-game basis, he does still draw a lot of attention from opposing defenses. He does carry a lot of gravity with his presence, and so because of that, he can help further unlock those types of three-point shots. So it's not like you're just jacking them and you're just shooting to shoot. No, with Şengün, even if he's not quite as dominant as he was earlier this season, he does draw enough attention on the scouting report that can help you actually get clean threes. And so I think with Şengün not able to take on the workload, maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's the back injury, maybe it's randomness, maybe opposing teams are defending him a different way. Regardless, though, for over a month leading into the All-Star break, he was not nearly as consistent as he was earlier in the season. The Rockets noticed that. We talked about Jalen and Jabari with Fred VanVleet and his size. It's a struggle for him to finish near the rim, but obviously he can shoot well for threes, and you're not getting Tari Eason back. So between all of those factors, for me, it makes sense that with this particular team and with the young guys where they are, this is the time to sort of err on the side of just let it fly and let's see what happens. That doesn't mean it's going to be the long-term approach. If some of these guys develop and look like very different players when they report to training camp in, late September, early October, then maybe you go back to something different at that time. But for now, given the losses, given the fact that no one is clearly trustworthy as a top option on a game in, game out basis, it just makes sense when you think about it, especially against teams that you're an underdog against, which they were on basically all 6 of these games coming out of the All-Star break. We'll see if the weaker scheduling stretch changes it, but I really don't think it will for the most part. I think it's just Ime and the staff recognizing that, look, this team as it is fairly limited offensively. So given those limitations and given the fact that there's not any silver bullet solution in terms of individuals, then for now, we just need to collectively try and go about things a slightly different way. And some nights the shots are going to go our way. And I gave him credit for adapting. To me, it makes perfect sense, does it not?
Yeah, as it's always better from a not, it's not chemistry the word I'm looking for, but it's always better from a team atmosphere standpoint to try something new than to keep doing the same thing and keep failing. So I just overall I think it's whether it brings more wins or not, it's always better to look like you're trying to walk a certain path or going somewhere rather than just giving up on the season, and which is why And I think this is a debate that people are going to start having very soon, and some people have already started having, which is why I don't think at any point they should turn to tanking to make the odds better to keep the pick. I think if you want to, if you want to do maybe do a Suns in the bubble, you want to kind of ramp into next season with some momentum. And I know that there's 3 or 4 months of off season, but I really do think it matters in the not the vibes, but in the mentality you have for the team. If you don't allow them to, just because the season may be lost sooner than the last week or so, they really I don't think they should do the typical, oh, we don't have a chance at the play and we should just sit our best guys or prevent injury or whatever it is, rest them and tank for a better pick. First of all, obviously because the incentive's not there as much as for other teams. But I really do believe that really even more so for how important of a voice you may keep is in the locker room. Like what does it really say if he's punting games, but at the same time next year comes in and says, oh, everybody's got to play super hard because
now
like
it's different.
You've got to you've got to be prideful and be competitive. It's I feel that this is the discussion that's going to be coming in the next few weeks, and I'm just getting ahead of it and saying, for the same reason, it was good that we changed approaches, whether the results come in or not. I don't think they should eventually move on from just trying their hardest every single game. We've done that for far too long. We've known the consequences of that.
Yeah, and I should point out that the schedule, while over the next 3 weeks, it's very manageable, it actually does get fairly difficult again in the last couple of weeks of the year. So you might just tank organically. I know that's, a word we don't like to use on Rockets social media, but I don't think you would ever consider quote unquote tanking prior to the last 2 to 3 weeks of a season. There's just way too many negative consequences. And then the schedule starting March 27th, you've got the Thunder on the road at Utah. I know they're sort of tanking, but they're always tough at home. Then you got the Mavericks, the Timberwolves, the Warriors, Miami, Dallas again, Orlando, at Utah, and at Portland. Manageable games, but on the road. And then you finish up in Los Angeles against the Clippers. So it's one of those situations. It may resolve itself with the schedule, in that if it gets to a point where you're officially eliminated from the play-in race and there's nothing on the line, then that coincides with the stretch of the schedule where the Rockets are playing teams that are firmly in the playoff mix and playing for seeding or to get into the playoffs as opposed to the play-in tournament, and so on and so forth. So it may just happen anyway. And those are the types of games where if you then win those games against really good teams and somehow you end up winning upper 30s to near 40 wins, then I think that's a good problem to have if you're Ime Udoka, Rafael Stone, and the Rockets. Now, to transition our discussion to something a little more of a downer, and of course that's the Tari Eason injury. As we've suspected for a while, he's not returning to the team this season, actually underwent surgery Monday. Ime Udoka said after the Saturday game in Phoenix that he had a benign growth on the inside of his tibia bone. He took a blow directly on that. It flared up. He played through it with some pain. He never had a chance of fracturing his leg, but it was just a pain tolerance thing. Once the pain got too high, he shut it down. We thought rest and rehab could help him get over it that way. But every time we ramped up the workouts, the pain came right back. He said a bone graft and rod will be placed in Eason's leg before he returns to the floor, and he should be fully cleared in 4 months. That'd be early July, which is, of course, well before training camp starts in late September or early October. So he'll have every opportunity in the offseason to do his conditioning and get right. And obviously it sucks for the Rockets. I do believe what we've reported on this show before. People inside the organization believe that on a permanent basis, he is their best player. I know he played just 22 games, largely in late November and December, but he was phenomenal when he played. He got them to the finish line in a handful of games when Jalen Green just wasn't able to do it. And the Rockets were able to grind out wins in December when they were at their best many times, with Tari Eason not just in the lineup, but in the closing lineup and playing effectively as a 2, showing even more versatility than we thought he had going into the season. On top of the defense, the rebounding, the motor, he showed some playmaking chops as well. We saw Ime Udoka toss out the young Kawhi Leonard comp dating back to when Ime was an assistant coach with the Spurs in the early years of Kawhi Leonard, and I don't think Ime would toss that out there lightly. That's a very serious comp for Tari, and it shows you just how much he's impressed this organization. And so it's definitely a blow. It's played a big role in this season, not going off the rails, but the Rockets drifting from 9th, 10th in the West, which would be a potential play-in tournament spot, to where they've been the last few weeks, 11th or 12th, and needing something of a miracle to get back into the play-in mix. They have definitely missed Tari Eason, and not having him as a difference maker off the bench or as a starting option, potentially. Maybe the Rockets do make a change to their lineup at the break, which they thought about if they had Tari Eason available to fill that Jalen Green role and not just have two rookies who, as we said in our last spot, there's no guarantee that those guys are better than Jalen anyway. So his absence has definitely been felt a lot. I also think that plays into why the Rockets have gone to this high 3-point volume approach out of the All-Star break. They just don't have enough talent to play in more conventional ways. So that's why they're trying something a bit unorthodox, and not having enough talent. Again, not having a guy who on a per-minute basis is your most impactful player on the entire team. Yeah, that's a huge, huge part of that. And so in the long run, I don't think this is something that is going to stick around, especially now that he had it resolved surgically. This is not like a soft tissue tear where somebody tears, an ACL or an Achilles, something like that, that it's not a situation where you have to hold your breath until they get back. And then you have to see, well, do they have quite the same juice that they had before? No, with something like this that's bone related, in 99.9% of cases, once you let it heal, it's healed, and it'll be like it never happened, and there shouldn't be any greater risk of re-injury in the future. So it sucks for now, but it's nothing that should dramatically limit his or limit in any way his long-term potential with the Rockets. And the other observation that I had about it, because we've talked about the curious nature of this, the way the Rockets have managed Tari's injury throughout this season, going from day to day to week to even month to month. And we both speculated, well, should they have taken this more seriously when it originally occurred in the preseason? I'm not going to say there are no questions now, because when it comes to this benign growth, certainly you can say, well, did they know that in October? And if they knew, did they properly account for that? I'm not a medical expert. I'm not going to say that I know exactly what they knew at every stop along the way. Certainly, there's still questions that you can ask. But in the big picture, I do feel a bit more relieved, because what I will say is that this is not a common injury. This is truly a freak situation where we're talking about benign growth that happened to be directly fallen on at the wrong angle by whoever it was in the Pacers in that preseason game. This is not like a sprained ankle that may happen again. And that's what we've been so concerned about in recent weeks, once it became increasingly obvious that he probably wasn't going to play, Tari that is, for the remainder of this season. We wondered, well, are the Rockets going to learn from this so that when somebody else has a stress reaction, because those are not that uncommon in a contact sport like the NBA, are they going to learn from what happened here so that if it happens with another key piece in future years, that it's handled and doesn't end up costing them almost an entire season? Knowing what we know now, I will say that this sounds like a very unusual injury, and one that ties back into something that really predated his entire NBA career. So because of that, I am much more willing to give the Rockets and their medical staff the benefit of the doubt and say, hey, this isn't a huge red flag. You don't necessarily need to worry about this, because it's not like a common injury that they just misjudged and just didn't take seriously enough. No, this is something that sounds pretty unique. And so hopefully Tari is back. Again, I don't think you should ever fully celebrate until you see him back on the court in the fall, although that should be pretty much a formality, assuming he goes through his normal workouts in the off season and whatever. But I know we all want to see him back on the court, and that probably won't happen until the preseason in October. But I just think that in terms of the bigger picture, I do feel a bit more relieved knowing that it's not just typical stress reaction. It's not something that happens every year in the NBA. It seems fairly rare. I can't remember in all my years covering and following the NBA, I can't ever remember hearing this benign growth before. So because of that, I'm much more willing to sort of say, hey, this actually was a very rare situation that probably will not be repeated. And so because of that, I'm not nearly as worried about the curious nature of the injury relative to, some of our recent pods. So that's sort of the silver lining. I don't want to make it sound like it's all good because losing Tari sucks. Anytime you see one of your best players undergo surgery, that's not a good day. But then at the end of the day, in terms of the big picture, medically, it shouldn't set him back. And then when you look at just the overall way this injury was handled, I feel a bit better now knowing just how unique this situation was. Paolo, was there anything you wanted to add on that front?
Yeah, you know, don't take this the wrong way. Well, when the news came out, I was actually relieved rather than upset. To me, we were approaching this for a while now, and I was really scared of the Rockets. Not forcing him to come back, but having him play through pain again, because I'm sure Tari was looking forward to playing again this season. He looks like the type of guy that likes to be on the court. Um, and so I was really scared that they may not take the safe approach on this. And so I was actually relieved when the news came out. It wasn't a downer for me. That being said, obviously it sucks for a guy to get hurt, but he's been hurt. We've known that he has been hurt for a while now. And we've gotten hints here and there that, he should that this is something more serious. And I've kind of expected it to end up in a surgery anyways, eventually. And so I just, I think long term for his career, this is the correct approach. I'm thankful that Rockets took this approach, as I've said in multiple pods before, because this was actually something that was worrying me. This is something to me that's way more important than a lot of the stuff that goes on during the season, Jalen Green making or missing shots, because I truly think Tari Eason is a top 2, if not top 1 player in this rebuild. When you balance out how likely he is to pan out versus the impact that he can have. And so just, giving the best wishes to Tari and his mom, who has been, posting status updates on Twitter. If you want to go follow, I think it's Momster, her on Twitter. She usually has some pretty great content, and
Momster is her display name, but it's just Tari Eason, her name, all
right.
one word, no dashes. Yeah, Tari Eason on Twitter. Yeah, she's given updates throughout the entire saga, which have been very, very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So just all of the positive energy to the Eason family, and hopefully, we know that the surgery went well. Hopefully, the recovery goes just as well, and we can have Tari at full strength at the beginning of the season.
Yeah. All right. So as we wind down the pod, we've been talking about, well, we started what's happened on the court the last couple of weeks, then transition to the medical news of Tari Eason officially being lost for the season, having surgery on his left tibia, should be fully cleared in 4 months and ready to go at basically 100% by training camp, the same way the Rockets anticipate Steven Adams, who they traded for, being fully ready to go by training camp in the fall. So just between those two guys, that will make this team a lot better in October than they are right now. And that's before we even go into the potential for some of these young guys to get better in the offseason or any other trade or signing that Rafael Stone might make in the months ahead. So if they can finish this season strong, there's a lot to build from that, because it's like, look, you're a competitive team as it is, and there are clearly reasons to believe that next year could be a lot better. And that's just from health and getting these two clear difference makers and Tari Eason and Steven Adams back into your rotation. Well, I guess with Steven Adams, it's not back into your rotation because he hasn't played for the team yet, but a guy that clearly you traded for because you believe in. And so getting those two guys back will help with rebounding, with defense in so many ways. So just between those guys, the Rockets will be better. And then you hope that some of your young prospects, Jalen, Şengün, Amin, Cam, Jabari, some of those guys take the next step as well. And that's what I want to conclude the pod discussing, because Tuesday night is the Paolo birthday game. Rockets against Wemby and the Spurs, who we all hate for obvious reasons. I-10 rivalry. We know what Wemby did against the Rockets on lottery night nearly a year ago. But there's also a game Wednesday night. It's a home back-to-back, and that's a rare national TV game for the Rockets. ESPN, 6:30 start. So if you have tickets, you need to try and get to Church a little bit early. But it's a game on national TV because it's the Rockets against the LA Clippers, who are, of course, one of the best teams in the league. And one of their best players is James Harden, who we've chronicled many times in the past had legitimate interest in returning to the Rockets last offseason. It was Houston that decided that that was not the right path, that they preferred the direction they went, which is getting veterans like Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, and Jeff Green that were more adaptable to a number of team building scenarios as opposed to James Harden. We know the I am the system comments. There's one way that you can play with James to bring out the best in him. And I just think there was some apprehension from Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka when it comes to balancing that with the development of these young prospects who are probably the key to, at least internally, whether you can take not just a leap into the play-in tournament range, but eventually into contention range in the years ahead as the 2020s progress. Not that your rebuild is doomed. If they don't, there are external trades you can make. But the simplest way would just be if some of these young guys turn into, all-star level talents themselves. And the Rockets thought the path they went was better for that. And I want to emphasize that going into this Rockets Clippers game, because I do think there's going to be a lot of talk, certainly on social media and maybe in the national media covering the game, about the choice the Rockets made, especially if James Harden does what he's often done when he comes back to Houston, which is play well in front of his hometown fans. I know it's not technically his hometown, but come on, James Harden is Houston at this point. There's a reason he wanted back. And there's going to be a temptation, especially if James plays well and Fred VanVleet does not, because really it's James versus Fred. You could have signed James into basically the same salary slot. You could have had James, Dillon Brooks, and Jeff Green. So really it's just James versus Fred when we talk about the hypothetical. And there's no doubt that James Harden is a better basketball player than Fred VanVleet. The Rockets know this. They knew this a year ago before they made these final decisions about free agency. And it's important to remind people of that before this game happens, because I think, well, we've seen it throughout the year. Anytime James has a good game, especially if it's paired with a bad one from Fred, even if they're not playing each other, then there's a lot of what-ifing amongst Rockets fans. And I just think that's missing the mark for why the Rockets made the decision they did. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that it's going to work out. I mean, it's a bet the Rockets made on the development of these younger guys, and time will tell as to whether they're right. But this was not a situation where the Rockets thought Fred was better for them in the 2023 to 24 season. No, this season was always about getting more competitive, but not literally trying to win every game. You're not in contention mode yet. So even if James would have been better than Fred this season, both individually and probably get you to a few more wins, that wasn't the top priority for the Rockets. The top priority for the Rockets was and is the development of this young core. And that's where they have questions about James being as strong of a fit as Fred has been. And I want to emphasize, it's not for the entire young core. I think Jabari Smith and Tari Eason are two guys that, because they're not ball dominant at all, the Rockets did not see them as clearly better with Fred than with Jalen. They thought Jabari and Tari, the nature of their games, would have fit perfectly with James. So it was not about them. The three guys that it was largely about were Alperen Sengun, Jalen Green, and Amen Thompson. You could maybe argue for Cam Whitmore stylistically, but I don't think he was a part of the calculus because the Rockets did not think they were getting Cam until draft night when he unexpectedly fell to them at 20, fell to their second first-round pick. And by that point, a week before free agency, the decisions had already been made. When the Rockets were finalizing the direction they were going to go, it was about Jalen, Sengun, and Amen, three guys that operate with the ball in their hands, and the question of whether the development of those guys could be compatible with a system in which James Harden is playing the way we know James wants to play. You think back to the Jalen Green podcast with Paul George, in which clearly he had some apprehension about playing that style of ball. You look at Alperen Sengun and the leap that he mostly has had this season. He's consistently credited Fred with a big role in that. Even if Alp hasn't been quite the same player the last 6 weeks or so, he still had a very, very good season, drew serious all-star consideration for a reason. And Amen Thompson, defensively, he's been a star. Offensively, the handle, the shot, obviously that's a work in progress, but he is taking steps forward. He is your point guard of the future. And of course, with Fred, because he's not nearly as ball dominant, the idea is that you can slide him in as the years progress into a more off-ball role where he spaces the floor as a shooter and he can contribute more defensively. Thankfully, Fred has been a bit better defensively since the All-Star break. Maybe that's getting fresher, the back healing up, whatever it may be, but he was struggling on that end uncharacteristically the few weeks leading into the break. I think that's been a little bit better since. But it's just the Rockets thought that Fred was more compatible with a number of different scenarios for team building. Whereas with James, there's one way for him to play, and especially with those guys that are more ball dominant in that young core, it's not that it would have been a disaster, but they just weren't sold on that being the path. And look, if these guys don't pan out, although to this point, at least to some extent, Alperen Şengün has. Amen has taken steps forward. Jalen Green, it hasn't been a great year, but I'm not out on him by any means. If all of those guys don't pan out, then sure, you can look back in a few years and say, well, should they have just signed James Harden, gotten a few more wins, and tried to build a team that way? Because if you sign James Harden, especially if you sign James and Dillon, then you're probably going to get back at least to 500-ish in the play-in field, and maybe you build the prestige of the franchise that way. You're more attractable to other stars as far as trade targets or signings, whatever it may be in the years ahead. Certainly, James would be good for the development of Jabari and Tari in particular. You can certainly argue that if the development of these more ball-dominant types doesn't pan out. But the point is, the bet the Rockets made was not one about this season. It was about many years. And I think that's what gets lost with people who are just so focused on the day in, day out. The Rockets did not think or project Fred to be better than James. They know James is still, at 34 years old, a legitimate all-star level player. And another thing I also want to push back on, I'm sure some will say, well, what about the contract? Was it because of that? No, I actually don't think that James Harden was demanding a 4-year max. I don't think it's a situation, I've seen this suggested, where maybe the Rockets went this path because Fred was willing to sign what's effectively a 2-year deal. The third is a team option. And there were a couple of reports that James wanted a 4-year max. Yeah, in a perfect world, he would have gotten that. But I think the proof is in the pudding. Besides how desperate he appeared, and I've been told this as well, to return to Houston, look what he did to get to the Clippers, which were obviously his number 2 choice. He opted into the final year of his existing deal, basically took what amounts to a 1-year, $35 million deal, because that was much easier for him to get to his final destination. He passed up getting a payday altogether. So yeah, I absolutely think that James would have taken a more short-term deal with the Rockets. And I love James. He's the second best player in franchise history. We did pods over a year ago in which I argued if the terms were right to potentially bring him in. So I don't think it's that the Rockets wanted James, but when he wanted too many years and he's 34 years old, so he's 4 years more advanced than Fred, then they pivoted to Fred on this 2-year deal. No, I don't think it was that at all. I think it was about playing style, and the Rockets simply viewed Fred as a better fit for the development of 3 members of their young core, and maybe 4. Although if Cam Whitmore's in that same bucket, that's just sort of a flukish circumstance because the Rockets lucked into him falling to pick 20. Again, I'm not going to tell you that the Rockets are right in that bet. Time will tell. And if those guys go bust, then yeah, it's absolutely possible that in a few years we say, well, the Rockets should have just taken the sure play-in berth, 500 record, just gotten back to more immediate relevancy with James Harden and figured out the rest later. Maybe that's the way it happens. But I just want to emphasize one more time before turning it over to Paolo for his closing thoughts. It was never about this season. It was never about a one-on-one comparison of here's what James can do, here's what Fred can do, and we think Fred is better. No, it was a long-term bet about at least the next 2 years and maybe beyond, because in a perfect world, I think the Rockets would love to keep Fred beyond his current contract. We'll see if the business can work out, but they love the guy off the floor. They love his leadership. I think they'll certainly look into that after next season, but there's a lot of data points to be compiled between now and then. But ultimately, that's what the Rockets are thinking. Not going to guarantee that it works out, but it was never about Fred versus Jalen this season. So even if James goes for 50 and Fred goes for 5, I just don't think it's a time to take a victory lap in either direction. The bet is just much more long-term. That would be sort of my cautionary tale going into this national TV matchup. Is there anything you wanted to add on that comparison, Paolo?
Yeah, I actually disagree with if Jalen, Şengün, and Amen don't pan out, we'll look back and think that James Harden was the better option. I actually don't even agree with that, because if those guys don't pan,
at least you had the chance to see. Yeah.
My take on that would be, if those guys don't pan out, James Harden was not going to be the difference maker. If those guys don't pan out, the rebuild is done anyways. Those are the 3 highest swing factors in this rebuild. If none of them turn into stars, we're cooked anyways. So I don't even think that James Harden would have, helped them. I actually think if James Harden, I think James Harden might have been good for Jalen Green, and hindsight it's one hell of a thing, right? But might have been good with Jalen Green as far as footwork goes, as far as driving into contact goes, as far as finishing at the rim through contact goes. I think Jalen has all the tools. James Harden had some of the tools. He wasn't an unathletic guy, but he was a lot more craft than he was pure athleticism. And if he could help Jalen with some of the fundamental, I think Jalen would probably be further along. That's the main argument I see for James Harden over Fred VanVleet. But at the end of the day, the Rockets were paying for a culture change when they brought in Fred VanVleet. Not just with him, but him plus other moves like Dylan Brooks. They were going for a culture change with Ime Udoka and everything like that. And that's what they got. This team this is a defensive focused team. You would not, I mean, the Clippers are a pretty good defense, but look at their personnel. They're not the run and gun, zero discipline team that they were the last 3 years. And so I think the bet on Fred VanVleet was largely successful. He's not the best player in the world. He's good. He's not great. But we knew what we were getting out of him. He's not underperforming expectations. He's been perhaps a little bit less consistent than we would have liked. He's had some injuries. He's been overplayed minutes-wise. But if I could go back, I would not switch him for Harden. And I think, well, I do.
And by the way, let me jump in real quick with your point on defense. I've seen a lot of people ignore context entirely when trying to compare Harden and Fred on that end. Fred's defense, while not what it once was 2 or 3 years ago, you also have to consider that he's playing alongside 3 incredibly young players in the Houston starting lineup, in Jalen, Jabari, and Şengün. 2 of them, Jalen and Şengün, having obvious deficiencies on the defensive end that could be career long potentially, as opposed to James Harden, who's playing with a veteran-laden team with Kawhi Leonard, Paul George. Zubac has turned into a decent presence near the rim. It's just an apples to oranges comparison. I've seen some trying to make it that, this defensive advantage for Fred and the culture isn't even that great. Look at what Harden's doing defensively. Look at the on-off numbers. No, trying to compare the veteran-laden Clippers to what the Rockets have here, you can't do that. That's totally different.
Yeah, and listen, I think my last point on James Harden is I think a lot of what he's doing this year, and I'm happy that he's having success. I'm rooting for him. I hope he wins the championship if the Rockets can get there, which it's looking very likely that they won't. He's playing next to Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. From a scoring perspective, from an assist perspective, they're down from last year, but last year they were inflated by just the post passes to Embiid that were giving him assists in the pick and roll game. But still, he only has to pass the ball to Kawhi Leonard, and he'll ISO into a jump shot, and he'll get an assist off of that. Not to minimize what he's doing, right? And he's getting a lot less attention offensively from the opposing team's defense than he would have here. And it's even forgetting that Russell Westbrook also plays there, and there's way too many variables for you to be able to say that what James Harden is doing with the Clippers is what he would be doing with the Rockets. But then again, it's not even about, regardless of what James Harden is doing, it's not about what he's doing, it's about what Fred's done for this team, especially from a culture perspective, as I've said before, and how this team is forming an identity around its young players with Fred and Dylan as catalysts. It's not forming an identity around Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks with the young players as the add-ons, which is, I think, what would have happened if James Harden were here.
Fair point. Yeah, I think we're largely in alignment. The comps, at least on my timeline, are just missing the mark as far as the reasons the Rockets made the choice they did. And there's still more data points to be taken as far as Fred and the development of the young guys, but I think it's a very defensible choice, and it's just important to remind people that it was never about just comparing these two guys individually in one season and projecting what the numbers would be. The calculus was much more bigger picture than that. And can some people disagree with that? For sure. But let's not act like that the Rockets didn't anticipate most of what has happened with these two players this season. That's where people seem to be, at least some, missing the mark. No, this was always the idea. And, reasonable people can disagree. Maybe there's an argument to be made on the other side, although, Paolo, you sort of deconstructed the one that I had thought of. You're being a bit more generous to what the Rockets were thinking internally. the point is, though, it was never about just comparing these two guys. And so while it's going to be natural to sort of put them in the spotlight entering that Wednesday night game, my guess is that, especially on social media, but maybe even some nationally as well, it's largely overdone, and people are just largely losing context with the decision the Rockets actually made and the factors that went into it. All right, with that, we will bring this episode to a close. Until next time, the best place to get a hold of Paolo and myself is on Twitter/X. He's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. And then the show is on there at The Logger Line, where if you hit up the link tree, you can find links to our friends, partners, and sponsors, Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Bar, but also our distributors like Apple, Google, Spotify. If you're not already, please subscribe, leave a 5-star review. You get the benefit of episodes as soon as they come out. And of course, we get the benefit with your hopefully happy review of looking good to our friends, sponsors, and partners in keeping this show going as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we will adjourn. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode. Go Rockets.